Well, here we are as we talk about the state of our economy with a focus on the inflationary rate and what the latest dynamics, moving from 33.9% in August to 37.2% in September. What does all of that mean? We analyze the numbers with Seth Terkper, former finance minister. But let me come into the studio first. Bernice Abubedu-Lansah is here with us. A very good morning to you.
Hello,
Bernice.
good morning to you. How are you doing?
I'm okay. It's a Friday.
Yes.
The week is ending without ending.
I love that. It's interesting. Great to have you here this morning as we discuss this very important subject matter because this matters to everybody, no matter where you are on the status ladder. Inflation hits everybody
Bread and butter
in
is
different
used.
ways. And so this is an important subject to discuss, and we have the right people to help us do that.
We also have joining the conversation Professor Lord Mensah, finance lecturer, University of Ghana Business School, and Professor John Gachi, Dean, UCC School of Business. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you. I just want to cross-check whom we have right now.
Right, everybody's on? Everybody's on?
Okay, so I see Mr. Terkper in there. There's also Professor Lord Mensah and Professor Gachi. I want to start, Mr. Terkper, from the standpoint of those changes. So before we even get into the inflationary rate, we know the reference year has changed to 2021 as more data is collected, and inflation is being driven by surging input costs and the slumping cedi. But this bit about the reference year changing to 2021, what does it really mean? What is your understanding of that?
Well, thank you very much. And good morning to your viewers and others who may be listening. It simply means that, the weight or the weight that is given to the various components, food, non-food, alcohol, and the rest, they are normally given weights. And so you see the categorization, that weight changes. And the reason it normally changes, in other words, one weight maybe, it used to be food, which for a long time may have say 50%, as services become dominant in the economy. It's similar to the rebasing of the GDP that we are also familiar with. So as the economy changes and trends, in the economic change, then the weights are normally revised, by Ghana Statistical Service, which there's most of this. So you may see one weight becoming heavier than another one, and it reflects normally in the case of inflation, the contributions which this make to the to the headline inflation that is given. I think in your analysis you were also looking at regional spread. You were looking at specific specific products or services, and how they also vary in relation to, the average. And so that is how I would explain it simply. The academics can also come in.
All right.
But if I may, you also mentioned another significant, and the changes of the basis is significant because then you may be comparing one way or the other apples with oranges if you go back and you say inflation is so and so. The weight that was in the previous year base, that is 2018, it was as recent as 2018.
Right.
And the previous one went back, further back. So the weights have changed, and therefore, if you are comparing food, price indices, they may not be exactly comparable. But the important thing is that the trend is still upward. Whether you take the old basis or the new basis, is still upward. And so, and that is a concern, which we should have.
Okay.
So that is, unless you want me to continue.
No, I think for now that will suffice because I want us to take it apart bit by bit before we get into the nitty-gritty. But for you, Professor Mensah, we also know that the government statistician has, like Mr. Terkper is saying, there have been some changes, and he has announced yesterday that the weighting in the regions as well is changing, even from the 10 to now the 16, and a further breakdown. What would explain this splitting even further? Like you saw me do the regional breakdown, we can see that some of the regions are performing averagely, but others like the Greater Accra region, the Central region, the Eastern region are way up there. And now in the Eastern region, for example, it's about 47.3%, thereabouts. What does that mean?
Well, good morning and good morning to our viewers. The weightings brings about certain kind of heterogeneity, if I say, differentials in terms of economic activities, in terms of population, in terms of consumption. So if you look at the new regions that have been formed, right? So for instance, you take the Western region, we have the old weight, which it used to be 9.2. And then the new north, Western North. I mean, if you split it, you have Western and then Western North. That means that the Western has more economic activities in terms of population and all those. So that is carrying about 7.3. And then when you take the Western North, which is lesser of economic activity, it's more or less like 1.9. So when you put the two together, we'll give you the old weight. So the weightings more or less brings down the various economic activities. As we're looking at inflation. Now, effectively, the regional, dimensions of inflation clearly depict exactly what is happening at the region in terms of consumption. I mean, So when you take food, transportation, and all those. So, I mean, Accra will always lead because Accra, more people consume transport service compared to the other regions, and possibly followed by Kumasi and all those. So the numbers reflect the economic activities that happens in those regions. And then when you take, for instance, the Bravo, the Bravo, per the old weight, it used to be 7, but now Bravo has been split into 2. So we have Ahafo, Bono, and then Bono East, which the 7 needs to be spread among the 3. So you realize that the 7, you have Bono taking about 3.5. So that means that the Bono carries more of economic activity in terms of consumption and then in terms of price reactions than all the other regions. So clearly, the weightings has to do with, the various economic breakdowns. But then, the inflation numbers that we see, as you can clearly see down there, Eastern region is topping. Now, Eastern region's inflation is more or less a transmission from Accra because it's kind of a neighboring region where most of the things that happens in Accra mostly spill over to that region. So I'm not surprised Eastern region is more or less topping the regional, breakdowns. But I mean, they are all reflections of the happenings in the economic activity. But if you look at, the general, inflation, we are increasing, which also sends a signal that is not positive to Ghanaians.
All right. I'll bring in Professor Gachi, and then Bernice will take it from there because we have quite a bit of questioning that we want you to address. But when you look at the chart that is on your TV screens right now, you would notice, Professor Gachi, that interestingly, the Ashanti region, look at inflation there, 31.1%. But in the Greater Accra region, you are talking 45.3%. In fact, in that belt, we have 2 regions, the Eastern and the Greater Accra, and right following them, the Central region, not surprisingly, with 41.9%. But why is the Eastern region at 47.1%? That's what some people cannot understand. The cost of living and everything. It's not the center of, practically everything. It's concentrated in Accra, yet things are more expensive in the Eastern region. Any reason why? Any reason?
Well, thank you. I think before I come to that, I want to make a quick comment on the change in the base period. And that has implication. If you look at it from price relative point of view, you realize that will feed into why some people believe that the inflation rate we are talking about is not reflective. Take it that the base period of 2018, a price of an item, I'm losing price relative,
right,
is 10 cedis. And the price now, 2022, let's say is 50 cedis. But the price in 2021, for example, is, let's say 25 cedis. So you realize that the movement from the base period 18 to,
right.
to this would have been higher. So it's like changing the base period within a short period of time. Of course, I believe the minimum period for them is 5 years, shows that we are accommodating price development.
Okay.
So that is one impression I believe we need to get clear. And as to why the Statistical Service think that they need to change the base period, there are factors that should be present before you change the base period, as to whether all those factors are present before they are changing the base period, and what particular economic goal they want to achieve. That has not been articulated. So I think that's something we need to.
Yeah, and I want us to quickly look at that. I was going to ask, so from where you sit, was it justified, this latest adjustment? And what could be the economic rationalization of it at this point in time? Is it to slow down the inflation? Is it to create a certain picture that inflation isn't as high as it is? School us.
Of course, as I explained, if we were not to change the base period, the inflation would have been much higher than what we have seen. Mm-hmm. So the question is, why do you choose to change the base period? What do you want to achieve? That should be part of the communique from the Statistical Service, and that should not be me trying to give reason.
But what would be the reason you could give?
Of course, normally when price volatility is too much to bear by the economy over a certain period of time, and you want to ensure that economic indicators are reflective of the true price changes and dynamics within the economy, that is when you do that. So the point I'm making is there is always an economic argument to change the base period. The economic argument has not been made by the Statistical Service, and that should be questioned.
Right.
And I'm not in position to explain that because of the proximity of Eastern region, that is why the inflation rate is taking some chunk transmission from Accra, because there are many other, there are two other or three other regions which are proximate to Accra. So why is it that their inflation is not at the level of Eastern region? So these are things that the Statistical Service should do and inform the public. So you don't just put these figures and then keep all of us struggling. So they have done the study and provided a picture that Eastern region, even looking at all the traditional regions that have been posting high inflation figures, are no more posting high inflation figure. What is the reason? That is a job that the Statistical Service to tell us, to know what strange thing is happening in Eastern region. It's not for us to be struggling to be providing reasons.
Right, Prof. So the IMF this week announced that we should expect the worst in 2023. In fact, they say that 2023 for many people will feel like a recession. So, I mean, here's where people say, well, we understand that there are global happenings that will affect a local economy like Ghana. But they argue that it is decisions and policies by our government which will ensure that these shocks do not hit us hard. So how do we handle this? Because there are many people who fear. We have done stories focusing on people's livelihoods and the standard of living, and there are those who are skipping meals already, you know, because of the high cost of living nowadays. So how do we handle this inflation rise that we're seeing lately?
Well, thank you. I think handling the inflation development is quite simple, but not immediate. Quite simple because the Statistical Service for some time have been disaggregating the data, and it is very clear to us most of our staples are receiving high price development. So that is what we should be targeting. What do we do to scale up production in the staple food areas? In fact, just as the IMF said, and that's what we have been saying over and over when we were talking about Ukraine and the rest, and we were making the point that if we were to scale up production of wheat in the north, if we were to diversify the production of bread from potato and cassava, as the case is scientifically shown, we wouldn't be feeling the effect of the Ukraine crisis. So it's a policy issue. So policies should be designed to address the production of those food items internally. And if that is done, I believe we can contain inflation, and the global effect of what the IMF talks about may be accommodated by us better than other countries.
Right. Let me bring Mr. Tekpe in here. Mr. Tekpe, last month, the central bank increased inflation rate to a record high 22%, among other measures to help deal with inflation and boost the economy. Like Professor Gachi has said, some of these decisions may not yield immediate results. First, what is your assessment of the central bank's decision to increase the benchmark interest rate, and how do you think it will impact the inflation figures we are seeing now?
Yeah, thank you very much. If I may bring another policy point quickly on what Professor Gachi has already said, you will see that when you look at our distribution by products, imported inflation is highest. It is 40.7% compared to food and non-food, which are 37.8 and then 36.8. And this may also be part of policy decisions like the benchmark that reduced the value on which imports are calculated, and which is therefore, putting a lot of pressure on domestic production, because imported food becomes, cheaper. So we may have to start looking at some of, those domestic policies. So another reflection is the loss of reserves. BOG is losing, significant, reserves. And let me then come to the fiscal. As the fiscal situation deteriorates, and you can see that BOG is under pressure, not just from the reserves, but also from the fact that they are financing the deficit. If you take the media review, which is the last data we have, statistics we have, 22 billion Ghana cedis out of the 37 billion deficit is financed by BOG. You can see a country that moved from zero financing in 2016 and then went to 10 billion, in 2020, under the pretext of, or the reason given was COVID. Now BOG is financing 2/3 of the budget. That's what it means, approximately 22 over 37, the deficit. That is deficit financing. I think we've been having that, So BOG, which one of its mandates in the Constitution, the two main ones are, facilitating growth, but also controlling, inflation or prices in the economy. And one of the tools that it uses to achieve this, and also to make sure that it's a quasi-fiscal act, it's reflective of what is going in the economy, is a policy rate. So it is a tool with which it is vested globally. It's a tool which are also vested in central banks. And another effect of this external effect is that globally, all central banks, particularly the major ones that did quantitative easing or flooded them, the markets with a lot of, credit by buying securities, are now winding that up, and they are also increasing interest rate. And that means that at a time when our borrowing from outside to support the budget is virtually cut, if we were to go back, we are also going to be borrowing at a higher rate. So you can see the number of factors which, a monetary policy committee just have mentioned just a few, is looking at. They are seeing inflation going up. Their mandate is to try, minimize that. They are seeing loss of reserves transmitting into, currency, devaluation, which is a factor in the import, prices being the highest, and they have to combat that. They are losing reserves, and their preparation may be quite tricky. In actual, but the consequence of that is that as they increase the policy rate, it affects other market rates. First of all, they are financing, and they're financing from the banks, because what they are assuming they were not printing, then what they are using to finance is reserves and others which they have mobilized from the same banks. It deprives private sector. So the government activity, the fiscal, which I've just explained, is bringing the banking sector very actively and government into the market. If the interest rates go up, it will worsen the case for the private sector. So that's another thing with BOG, because their own interest rates increase, and what the banks are seeing by lending to government means that, less money is going to the private sector, and the private sector is, is also now going to be paying high interest rates, including the government itself, So if I may, a last point before I yield, the concern we have now is debt. And BOG will be looking critically, because we're talking about BOG here. The Ministry of Finance should also be looking critically, because if the cedi keeps depreciating as it is, then the dollar component of the debt, when converted to cedis, could also, be high, right? So it depends on the relationship between the cedi and the dollar. So BOG Monetary Policy Committee looks at, all these, factors, and they have been under pressure for some time now, to be financing the deficits. And this will be very critical in the discussions with the IMF that is ongoing. So the IMF statement reflects globally and global developments, as Professor Dachi has said. Ukraine, as I've added, interest rates, other factors. So they are talking globally. And what is meant by countries should look inward at their policies is precisely some of the reasons which I have given, which we would have to convince the fund going to an IMF program, that this will not continue to worsen the Ghanaian situation.
I'll come back to you for more on the IMF program, but let me go to Professor Lord Mensah now. So it's interesting that the IMF we are looking to for support to help in stabilizing our economy is saying that, look, next year is going to be worse. In fact, there's a downward revision of the global growth rate for 2023. It's now 2.7%. And this is a downward revision from this year. We forecast 3.2%. Do you get a sense that the IMF may be preparing the minds of citizens of countries that are coming to it for support, that, look, it's not just going to be a snap in the finger, that even though we are going to give you the bailouts that you're requesting, it may not be a ride in the park for you? And this is to you, Professor Lord Mensah.
Yes, indeed. They're sending a signal to, potential IMF visitors, and Ghana is one of them. And clearly, most of these countries that are going to IMF must position themselves for a program. And positioning yourself for a program means that the usual way of doing your things, when a situation where you read budget and you look at a budget deficit of about 33 billion and over, may not be no more, because government may not have that free space to spend as expected. So effectively, that is more or less a pressure, which a lot of citizens are going to have a pain to that. But then, on the other hand, it's also on a good side, because it's a form of economic restructuring. Where the aggressive way of managing the economy and then driving the economy to a point where our debt has grown to unmanageable situation. With the IMF, I think preparing yourself for IMF, I think, will keep us in line, and then bring our, budget, deficit to a target where we can easily, manage. So effectively, it is a good thing. But at the end of the day, we may have to look at, the IMF itself and what they stand for. Because for me, for IMF to come out and say that the next year is going to be a difficult year for countries like Ghana, I question, what they stand for. Because from where I sit, IMF is more or less an insurance. And you know very well that if any country is in trouble, they will fall back to, IMF in case, they are part of the fund. And being, more or less an insurer, I think if things are not going well, you may have to come out, to indicate. And I know they have country reps here and there. Why would you watch countries to borrow to a level where they cannot manage? And I ask myself so many questions, whether the IMF may want countries to be in trouble so that they create jobs for themselves, or possibly without, developing countries being in trouble and coming back to them to borrow, they may not, be active as expected.
Prof, a quick intervention. Professor Mensah, a quick intervention. We know that, yes, with the IMF, it's mostly developing countries that are on board. Usually you wouldn't find, the developed entities with them. I think the UK, for example, it was in the 1970s or 80s, the last time they went in there, and they were quickly out. But the point you make about creating jobs for themselves, whose fault would it be? The IMF or these developing countries like Ghana, which break their fiscal balance? It is not their fault, is it?
Let me give you an analogy to this. You see, when you take up an insurance, you pay a premium, isn't it? So Ghana is part of the fund. So we contribute to the fund. And knowing very well that in case of difficulty, we may fall on that fund. But then the fund manager, the insurer, what do? If you take a house, what do you call it? The fire insurance. Usually they allow you to put some mechanisms in place. If you take up, motor insurance, what do? They make sure that you have driver's license, you are prepared to drive. They won't give the license to anybody at all. And even to the extent, sometimes they may have to monitor, consistently to see whether you are doing the right thing or not. IMF has country representatives. When we exited IMF somewhere 2018 thereabout, and we started, ballooning our expenditure, getting to a point where we cannot manage now, that is increasing our debt. What did they say? They didn't say anything. To some extent, they were praising government of the day. Now you come back to tell Ghanaians that you should brace ourselves for next year, and everybody knows that next year is not going to be a normal year because it's a year that government is going to squeeze itself to ensure that they spend within the limits that they can manage. So for me, sometimes I question what they stand for, and like I said, countries being in trouble is more or less a way of creating jobs for them. And that is why possibly they may watch government, do whatever they want, get to a point where they will come back to IMF.
So is this some sort of, Bernice, my apologies, is this some sort of vicious cycle that is at the top of which we have the Bretton Woods institutions, in this case, the IMF? In other words, is this intentional? And in this instance, have they failed Ghana?
Yeah, they do. I mean, we were here when government started spending unnecessarily. Government, started giving freebies during COVID, thinking it would have ended somewhere September in that year. And by extension, we went into it till somewhere into the election. And we've been complaining about, overspending in elections. So, I mean, if you watch government to spend in that manner, I know it very well that overspending will call for borrowing. And the borrowing, once it gets to a point, the country will become distressed. Obviously, you should come in and then prompt the government that, look, what you are doing, how long would it take to send out information or send out a signal to the finance minister that the aggressive nature of, your economic management can put us into trouble? Prof, you wait for the country to be in trouble before they come to you. So that's where my problem is.
Permit me to do this, Prof. So the IMF is an institution. Ghana is a sovereign nation. You're talking about a certain advice. That's the best they can do. They cannot squeeze the finance minister or the government of the day to heed that advice. Also, they do not come to us to suggest that we should come to them.
I'm not saying
Prof,
the government.
I'm making a point.
The government to hate
I'm not saying that's what you're saying, Prof. Please permit me. Please permit me. So, again, it is our decision to go to the IMF. And I'm saying this because of the impression being created that, well, they may be sitting aloof just so that they could give themselves jobs to do. Shouldn't this be squarely the fault of our leaders? And I know that in the past, for example, the World Bank rep in Ghana has had reason to complain about some of the policies of government.
Yeah, the leaders themselves have, they have their share of the blame, and I'm not dissociating them from, the blame. But then, I'm saying, the external institution like, IMF, because consistently they come out and it's like, oh, government is doing well, government is doing well. But then a government that is doing well, how come, going into next year, you are more or less sending a signal that the people should brace themselves for an austere or possibly a difficult time ahead. So,
Maybe,
I mean, it's like watching government, and when things get bad, that is when you come and give the people the signal. And we all know that looking at what is on the ground, effectively going forward, things are not going to be the same. Because this is a government that has gone to a point where you cannot finance from the Eurobond market anymore. Because if you look at the rate at which our exchange rate is moving, it tells you that it's the Eurobond that we've been getting that has been cushioning us. Because all the other loans that we get to cushion our exchange rate has come in this year. We've gotten the proposed syndicated loan. To some extent, we have this Afro-Exim Bank loan. Effectively, the only one that has not come in is the Eurobond, that we normally visit. And clearly, that is what is pushing, But let me also tell you one thing. If you break down those who demand, the dollar, on the market, we have the government, we have businesses, and then we have individuals. The government is the biggest demander of the dollar. And if you fail to visit the Eurobond market to raise money to offset your dollar obligations, you may have to. The government is now looking at the local market, and that is why there's pressure. And if it continues that way, we will deplete our buffers, and that is why our buffer has depleted to only 2.6 months or so, when it used to be around 4.3 months. So, the bigger demander of the dollar is on the market here to raise money to satisfy its interest obligations this year. And that is why we keep on having the dollar going up unnecessarily.
Right, Prof. Now, let me just say, maybe Benjamin's interview with the IMF boss can help clear things here. Well, she says that what we're experiencing in Ghana is not as a result of bad policies, but due to external events like the Russia-Ukraine war. Let me bring in Mr. Tekpe, because you have been a finance minister before. Share your experience with us. Maybe the IMF doesn't come out openly to hint at some of these things that government does. Tell us what your experience was. Do you have
That's why I'm saying they are part of the problem.
Well,
Mr. Tekpe, do you have the IMF rep in Ghana, for example, walk into your office, have a meeting, discuss some of these things? Just tell us how it happens.
Well, thank you very much. The main indicator which the IMF uses to advise countries when the country is not in a program, which is why it is immaterial whether you are in a program or not, is Article 4. The difference is that in a program, you have benchmarks to meet, and you have told the fund that you are going to meet those benchmarks. Secondly, unlike the COVID fund, and I'll come back to that, unlike the COVID fund and the SDR, which came from the IMF, which were given to us a lump sum. When you are in a program, the assistance is given in tranches. And the condition for satisfying a tranche is that you must perform. And that is why when a country is under an IMF program, it tends to perform. And it's the other reason why the IMF is hated in developing countries, with all due respect, hated in quote, in developing countries is the one word conditionalities. Because remember, the IMF, I would say, is an insurer, yes, but it is also a lender. Just like Australia is lending to government. IMF as a central bank for developing countries is a lender. And it must make sure that you
They make money.
Yes, of course they make money, just as our central bank makes money. That's the only reason they can build a trust hospital and others, right? So, yes. But let me...
they must be in business.
Okay, Prof, let me laugh. So the point I'm making is, you are right. You are a sovereign country, right? Of course, the vote depends on your quota. But in terms of diplomacy, they will treat you the same way. And therefore, they will say that their request for assistance is demand-driven. That's the expression that is used in the fund. It's demand-driven. Let me point out that we have a lot to do in terms of we also maturing. Again, I don't mean it in derogatory terms. I'm being careful so it doesn't divert from the discussions. And let me give you one example. When we entered the fund program in 2015, if you recall, from 2013 through 2014, the PRMA was in place. And we put in the homegrown policy that we were bent on going ahead with a sinking fund because we want to make sure that when we borrow, we can pay gradually over time so that we can become debt sustainable. We had the stabilization fund out of the experience of the developed and other developing economies, which economies will call the counter-cyclical measures that you have to take. We put this on the table. In fact, the fund's question at the time was, wouldn't you want to give priority to the deficit coming out of a single spine, doom-saw borrowing, remember, for which we did ESLA, without prompting from the fund. We did it internally. ESLA was internal. We did it, went to Parliament, and informed them. We said, yes, they want to balance the budget, the theme of the 2015 budget. We don't want to focus on deficit, which would only balloon the debt. We also want to use, those sinking fund and other resources to manage debt. They respected it. In fact, at one point, it was like looking critically at the deficit, and some money was about to be taken from the sinking fund. We said, no, you have to go to Parliament to do that. As a result of which, we succeeded in reducing the rate of borrowing. We used $550 million US of our own money to pay up first sovereign bond, and then to refinance domestic bonds, which we kept rolling over, right? These experiences, and these are things which countries that have weaned themselves off the IMF in real terms, have been doing. You can talk about the Asian tigers, you can talk about the Latin American countries, Colombia and the rest. You can talk about, the emerging economies of the Middle East. You can talk about the countries that were communists without a market economy wanting to join the European Union. These are the tools that they put in place in order to manage. So my point is that Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly its middle-income countries, would have to behave like middle-income countries and put these buffers in place. We saw what the sinking fund did for us. We were able to take $250 million US to tackle COVID first, right before we even went to the fund, COVID loan and the World Bank and others. So part of the blame would have to do with us, putting measures in place and sustaining them. With 3 oil fields, we never sustained, these problems. And I tell you, because the sinking fund is depleted, the stabilization fund is depleted, because even with 3 oil fields, and even when we're getting 6 billion, let's not forget, 3 billion of which came from the IMF and the World Bank, the institutions we are talking about, under the pretense of COVID and the rest. Even whilst we were getting all of this, we did not restore the cap, or we did not remove the cap on the stabilization fund, and we kept depleting it. So if you put that in the context of our own development, the problem we are going to have is that as the fund is warned, when we are hit by the next crisis, we will not have those.
Right.
We will not have those buffers. And the fund, as a lender, that is why the debt sustainability analysis has become the key thing, because the fund itself would not lend to a country that is bankrupt, and that is why, or near bankrupt. And that is why we are being pushed to do a restructuring of that debt, which may be a condition for finalizing the negotiations.
Right. The issue of conditions of finalizing the negotiation, the former president, John Dramani Mahama, whom you served under, is asking the IMF to make this a condition that government or the presidency cuts down on its expenditure. We've also heard from the likes of Odike, who is asking that the issue of illegal mining should be a condition. It appears that a lot of people are throwing conditions or suggestions of conditions in the way of the IMF. But do you see that we will be able to get this bailout by the end of the year, as is expected by government?
Well, let me put it this way. We are a country which, coming out of 2019, Article 4, the fund wonders. The fund made a lot of revisions. Bailout costs, which used to be below the belt, was added. They adjusted our deficits. They adjusted our debts. We used to say this. And it's sad that part of not saying that, the problem had to do with COVID. And no, we had those difficulties. If you take Article 4 and the COVID report, it shows that our gap, fiscal gap, which is unfunded, is 3 to 5%. It's in the fund report. So it is a question for us, as we speak. Please, aren't our suppliers who provide food for school children saying that they have not been paid? Aren't contractors saying that they have not been paid? Don't we have IPP loan, which we haven't paid despite ESLA? Don't we still have depositors who have not been paid, even though we have ESLA, which was the purpose for which we went to Parliament and should have lasted 3 to 5 years? I think this question is for us. And yes, I agree with my boss, because we put some of these things up front. Remember, we went to Senchi, a consensus, and we put some of these things up front. They didn't have to, as I said, we did ESLA. It didn't have to be forced down our throat. Of course, it was rigorous. It was called a nuisance tax. We went to Parliament. So I think we should begin to turn these questions, for ourselves.
Okay.
And before my boss made the current statement, remember, he asked for a Senchi-style consensus on the national pushing expenditure against a stagnant revenue, right? Against a stagnant revenue, which is what is leading to the borrowing. And now our stopping of using the sinking fund to service the debt as we kept borrowing, being locked out of the external markets, right? In any event, going to the external markets to borrow, yes, and we did, and you get foreign exchange. But the objective shouldn't be foreign exchange. That is why we started schemes like self-financing. For the dollar-based revenues that we are receiving, should be paying for some of the projects which are dollar-based. So that even if you go and borrow in dollars, you should be able to, ring-fence some of this, revenue. So in short, what I'm saying is that we should, yes, it will come as a condition. It's immaterial whether President, but there hasn't been any of our 17 or 18 programs that we have done without expenditure management. And we are not talking about expenditure management. And we cannot observe those expenditures when we can't even go to the markets to borrow.
Right.
Where are we leading? Yes.
Thanks for those important points you've made, Mr. Tekpe. Just hold for us. I want us to look at a few things tied to the IMF, since we brought up the IMF, before we segue back into the inflationary rate and what it's pegged at, because now we see it shooting up more than we saw from July to August. But when you look at the IMF and what it said only yesterday on the back of our monetary policy rate, they have made it clear that we have to have a balancing act. And this is for you, Professor Gachi, that we have to have a balancing act so that we don't spin off into a recession, which is something that we could get into if we don't manage things right. But when I look at the monetary policy rate in the slides that I shared right before we came on, the one, when you look at September 2021, you would see that inflation was at just 10.6%, and then the policy rate at the time at 13.5%. Then we get to the crucial month of February 2022, where there is that crossover. Inflation takes over from the policy rate, hitting 15.7% when the policy rate is at 14.5%. And all the way from there, we have never seen a decline. Right now, it stands at 37.2%, with the policy rate being at 22%, even on the back of the latest hike in the policy rate. Are we getting it right? Are we on that slippery slope that the IMF is speaking of? And should we, in the month of February 2022, when inflation started upping the ante against the policy rate, is that where we should have acted? Did we miss out?
Well, thank you. I think it's very clear that the policy is not achieving its objectives. While policy rate is expected to contain inflation, the policy rate and associated policies announced by the Bank of Ghana are rather contributors to inflation. That is what you are seeing there.
Wow.
Now take a situation, yes, because like Mr. Honorable Setekpe said, that when you increase the policy rate, you are virtually increasing other rates in the market, and those rates are associated with the private sector consumption, production, etc. And that will have effect in the pricing because their cost structure would have changed as a result of increase in cost of access to credit. So that is what is happening. And at the same time, the Bank of Ghana has also decided that they were increasing the cash reserve, which means, and in the environment where the report already indicated about 89 to 90% of lending of financial institutions, including insurance companies, pension funds, go to government. So you have virtually crowded out the private sector and make credit very costly for the private sector, even though it's not even effective. So that is what you have done over the period. So while you are reducing the ability of the financial institution to provide credit to undertake economic activity, you are hiking the rate. What you are doing virtually is to create a cost that will be translated into price development, and that is what we are seeing.
So you're basically saying that the monetary policy,
and the effect is not only on price development, it's also on damping nature of growth. So when your real interest rate is continuously higher than your real growth rate, what you see is what the IMF is warning about. But I also want to indicate that the IMF warning is timely because it is natural that when you are preparing for a budget and economic policy, you are guided by some of these global indicators so that we will be watching to see whether that global picture will be reflected in the growth forecast for 2023, expenditure forecast for 2023. That is what I believe we'll be watching for.
May I add a quick dimension?
Very quick one, Mr. Tekpe.
Yes, quick one. In terms of BOG and the economy, remember, as I said, BOG itself was accommodating the deficit. And therefore, it gave government the opportunity not to trim expenditure, even when we all knew that the expenditure was ballooning. And as I said, this was an institution which, through a memo with the Ministry of Finance, was enforcing financing, and suddenly went, on the binge and started, financing the deficit. So it is also part of, which is inflationary, because the government is just, spending. And therefore, we have not addressed the issue of expenditure. It will be an imposition from the fund, whether we demand it or not. It will be, because the deficit cannot remain unsustainable. You cannot control debt without looking at your deficit and slowing down the rate of expenditure and the rate of borrowing. And that means that Bank of Ghana is likely to be a prior action that Bank of Ghana would have to contract the pace at which it is financing the deficit, because it is not good for the economy.
Professor Gachi, so what then would you propose? Should the Bank of Ghana slow down on the monetary policy hikes? What should be the next move as inflation keeps going higher?
Well, I think the policy hike is not achieving anything except to contribute to cost development and destabilize the direction of inflation. So Bank of Ghana will have to look at that again because the policy objective is not being achieved.
Sorry, Benjamin, on the question on whether this decision should have been taken earlier in February when we saw that the inflation rate had overtaken the policy rate at the time. Prof, your response to that?
Exactly so.
So action should have been taken from then, right from then?
Much earlier.
And yes, and I agree. I would say that we should have used the 6 billion approximately of COVID assistance we got, including our own 250 million, COVID fund, COVID loan 1 billion, SDR 1 billion, Bank of Ghana 1.7 billion, which is the equivalent of US dollars. World Bank just told us that, they've given Ghana more money, the current government more money than any government, close to $1 billion. So if you add all of this
million,
what did we do with the $6 billion? We should have used it to do a correction, a correction by cutting, looking at the expenditure so that we create the necessary buffers. But all is going to the wind, and we are where we are now.
Let me just bring in
debt restructuring.
Professor Mensah quickly before we look at other issues. So interestingly, the IMF is forecasting a deficit by end of year of 9.2% of our GDP in 2022. But tied to this entire conversation we're having, there is also the bit about debt restructuring. Professor Mensah, we've had time to talk about it a lot. There is now the question of 94% of Tier 2 pensions which could be affected. And here's the bit. That would be about 3.7 billion Ghana cedis of the 3.9 billion Tier 2 pension contributions placed in government securities that could be affected. And of course, we know what such a haircut would mean when it comes to Tier 2 pensions. The analogy has been made that, for example, if we get a 20% haircut on about a sum of 1 million, that would mean you get 800,000. What is your take on that? What is your reflection? Is it a real possibility? SSNIT has come out to say Tier 2 pensioners should not be worried. But is it a real possibility where we are? And what would it mean?
Yeah, I mean, it is the possibility. Because if you look at a Tier 2 and the kind of investment that has been earmarked for it, clearly they are all government-oriented investment. And if it turns up that government, reduces interest rate, and let me tell you one thing, if the haircut comes up, right, it's going to affect pensions. It's going to affect insurance companies because all the monies, the premiums they are collecting and all those contributions goes into government securities. If you look at the FPRA's allocations for the kind of investment pension managers are supposed to do, about 80% are in government securities. So if it turns up that interest rates are supposed to be reduced as a result of debt restructuring, then obviously it's going to affect this investment, including the Tier 2 that we are talking about here. So, and without debt restructuring, government cannot manage this debt that we are talking about, the situation we find ourselves in. Because the external, inflows, which is coming as a result of the Eurobond, has been frozen on us. And so, and in the local environment, interest rate has gotten to a point where if government does not find means of, get busted to a level where it can be managed, because it has bubbled and it's still bubbling, right? So we need an intervention to bust it up and bring it to a point where government can manage it. And so that restructuring is imminent, and it's going to be a way of, positioning the economy for an IMF program. Now, the IMF will never lend to a country that is in distress because they know very well that even if they come to your rescue, whatever support they give you may go into your debt payment. So you may have to negotiate your debt before they come in. But it's unfortunate the administration is not bold enough to tell Ghanaians that we are doing self-restructuring, but rather they want to hide behind, IMF. That is why they will go to Washington before they come and announce, restructuring to tell us that it's IMF who is calling for this restructuring. It's not the IMF. We may have to take a bold step to make sure that we restructure our debt to a manageable point, and that is why the 5-member committee has been called in. And if you look at the composition of that 5-member committee, it's cut across banks, insurance, pensions, and all those. So effectively, they know what is about to happen. But then the finance minister is managing the situation to hide behind the IMF, to give the signal that it's the IMF that is calling for the restructure.
So in other words,
to give you...
So just a quick top up, Mr. Tekpe, so maybe you can address it and Bernice will come in. So in other words, this is imminent, but I want to find out, in that debt restructuring, whether we're narrowing it down to pensions, Tier 2 pensions, or generally, what is then going to be the best case scenario and the worst case scenario? And I want us to look specifically at the pensions. What would be the impact?
Right. Fantastic. So the best case scenario will be that if interest rates should be reduced, when the pension fund or fund managers collect these pension contributions and then they invest them, they also profit from a certain spread. So possibly they're looking at maybe pension contribution and then returning maybe 20% to pension contributors. And then they invest with the government to about, let's say, 26%. So there's a spread of 6% that they are enjoying. Now, when it turns up that the haircut is within the spread, so possibly maybe 3%, then the banks at the pension funds at their level may be ready to absorb this, reduction in the rate. So possibly they may not go out with the 26%, but they will go with 23% now, which is within their spread. So they can absorb it at the upstream level, without maybe tickling it down to the retailing, right? Effectively, that will keep the confidence in the economy that we have. But if it turns up that, the haircut goes beyond the spread that the pension, fund managers wants to enjoy, possibly 8% or coming to 18%, then obviously they may have to pass it on to, the pension contributors. And in that regard, it's going to reduce the confidence that we have in contributing for pension and government's, ability to raise money. Pensions are long-term, and that is where possibly we may look at, having kind of, long-term infrastructure investment to put those monies into. So the economy in itself will have its horizon of investment coming to short-term. And I won't be surprised in a worst-case scenario, seeing almost everybody doing, 91-day, treasury bill to serve as an investment. Even if they want to do 1 year, they may like to do, 91-day rollover for four times, So effectively, it has serious economic repercussions. And so that is why the engagement with the 5-member committee's engagement, we're hoping that it will come out clear, if for nothing at all, between the pension fund managers, between the banks who have collected people's, investment and they have put it in the government, business, they should be able to share the spread, and would the bank be ready to, share the spread or maybe absorb the spread? That is another question we may have to look at.
Well, I know that but Mr. Tekwe, please continue.
Yes, I just want to give a very practical example of a domestic restructuring. In 2015, whilst we were going to the fund, the 1 billion sovereign bond that we did, which was guaranteed by the World Bank, was used entirely to restructure domestic and foreign bond. What happened? Because we had the 1 billion, we paid off some treasury bills and other bonds, the 2011, 2010 bonds that were issued to pay off the single spine, which were maturing. So we paid them off. Now, secondly, we used 200 million to pay off part of the first sovereign bond, which is why we had to use $550 million US of our own money. The effect of this was that you saw treasury bill rates go down. These are the reasons why treasury bill rates went down from about 23% to about 16% by 2016 when we were leaving office. Because we didn't have to force a haircut. The government was less in the market. Government was not doing rollovers and therefore being forced, to pay higher interest rates, right? Then, secondly, ESLA, as a result of the debt that VRA and others had accumulated, we went to Parliament. And crude oil prices had fallen, so we used part of the tax that was being paid to set up ESLA. And immediately, as a result of that, in the negotiations with the banks that lent to VRA, we were able to reduce the domestic debt which they had taken from about 25% to 21%, and were able to reduce the external debt of 11 to 13% down to about 8.5 and 9%. And that's because we were liquid and we had the resources. But the final point about this is that we did not want those debts to pile up in the future. Again, this is where the sinking fund comes in. And so we set up the sinking fund and we assure the markets that this is constitutional, this is in the law, the Public Financial Management Act, and we're therefore going to use the sinking fund over the period of the 12 years of the World Bank debt loan, guaranteed bond, pay off our external debt, in fact, up to 75% from Jubilee alone. So these were practical measures that were put in place. I think when
we
talk
don't
about
have the money now.
Self-financing, well, yes, because we are depleted. And that's the point. We do all this, but with 3 oil fields, we rather depleted. As Professor Gachi said, we depleted, all the buffer from stabilization to sinking fund, and all went into expenditure. I remember we even debated sweeping the heritage fund to finance, free SHS, if you remember. Right, so I think we should go back. So this has been done. The only situation we are facing now is likely to be the Sri Lanka and another situation where we do not have those buffers, to
we don't have them.
To be able to go to the
it will be forced on us.
A stronger position. Yes, it will.
Right, gentlemen, we'll be wrapping up our conversation shortly in about 10 minutes. But let me just mention, because Professor Lord Mensah mentioned about people wanting to invest in treasury bills. I know that banks are struggling now. There are people who are coming in their numbers to withdraw their investments, and it's causing a strain in a lot of banks. But let me come to you, Professor Gachi. We have discussed government measures and policies to address the current economic crisis we are facing. Just this week, we saw in Kumasi business owners closing their shops, protesting the current tax regime, coupled with the current economic situation. They say it's too much for them to deal with. We've dealt with government. How do businesses position themselves to deal with the times that we are getting into, as we see the IMF predict worse times?
Well, I think we need to go back to the issue of debt restructuring because I'm not looking at it from just an activity going on in the market. This is a legal matter. Remember that those who bought into treasury bill and government bonds and the rest is a debt contract, and the government is obliged over a period of time to pay interest and principal. Now, this same government controls all the regulatory institutions. I am aware that as far back July, August, the regulatory institutions have started collecting data as to the amount of exposure of fund managers to government bonds and other instruments, which means there has been some preparation. There seemed to be some indication that government attempted external debt restructuring arrangement but failed. And the only thing left now is the domestic one. And this might be addressed in a manner that will exhume that confidence. Like you are saying, a number of people are lining up to discount their treasury bill. What's the implication for that going forward? Government will have to come back quickly, show transparency about the entire thing, give some indication as to where we are heading towards, so that people will position themselves very well in such a way that there will not be a quasi-run on our financial institution in terms of demanding to discount investment. That is very crucial. And I think we need to send this message very clearly to the government.
Right. Prof, my question specifically was to business people who may be watching us. I mean, how do they position their businesses? What decisions do they take? You can extend any advice, if you have it, to even individuals, because homes are suffering. People are struggling to meet their daily demands for paying electricity, water, buying groceries, and all these very basic things that people need to survive.
Well, I can only advise business people to restructure their activities, look at the cost that is.
Not just government restructuring, but businesses.
Of course, you see, that is a broader discussion. That's a broader discussion we need to have. Sure. You see, those that are supposed to be the drivers of economic activities are also indebted to financial institutions. Government policy and activities have actually dwarfed their significance. And that is why they are crying. When you go to the foreign exchange sector, the businesses are hit hard. When it comes to prices, hit hard. Everything is at odds with the business person. But that business person doesn't have that opportunity to go to financial institution to restructure. Government, who has borrowed all the money, has. So it's something that we need to put in a package and discuss holistically.
Right.
Even when we attempt to succeed in this debt restructuring, there is some implication for regulatory reporting. What will be the overall implication for even the regulatory requirement for non-performing loans, even in the financial sector? All those things will have to be discussed broadly for us to if not, so we'll do all these things and the financial institutions become impaired, they become weak. Already we do know a number of financial institutions are weak. So as for the businesses, it is very difficult to tell them what to do. They are in a very serious situation that all these discussions should be broadened to cover them.
Right, Prof. Thank you so much.
For me, just two quick wrap-up comments. If you could do less than a minute, each of you, it's for each of you as you wrap the conversation. One, we're at 37.2% when it comes to inflation. Food inflation is at 37.8%, non-food inflation 36.8%. And then, of course, we can talk about imported inflation, which is at 40.7%, and then local, which is at 35.8%. 37.2, we're just, 2.8 percentage points away from 40%. Can we hit that by end of year? And when it comes to an IMF program, the Minister of Finance has given us a hard date, November 15. Now they're in Washington, D.C., talking about some of these matters. Do you think we would get a program before the next reading of our budget? Those are my two quick questions. I'll start with you, Professor Gachi, then to Professor Mensah, and finally, Mr. Tekle.
Well, I'm not sure about getting a program by that time because, as I indicated earlier, I consider the domestic debt restructuring as a precondition to keep going. And I don't know how that will be concluded before the 15th of November. And you should also bear in mind that as a sovereign country, our parliament will have to look at what is contained in the IMF program that is agreed upon, discussed and approved. All those processes are there, and I don't think that we should rush unnecessarily to this end.
Can our inflation hit 40% by end of the year?
That is highly possible because there's what we call pass-through effect. Some of the policy announcement will have about 3-month pass-through effect. So there is that possibility that we will continue to have some increase in inflation. As to whether it will be marginal or very high increase, I'm not in position to say. But definitely those pass-through effects will cause increase in inflation. And I am not distinguishing at this point between imported inflation and food or domestic inflation, because in my opinion, most of the food items are now imported. So they are influenced by imported inflation, so to say. So those are the things we need to be looking at. Gone were the days when our imported inflation is limited to intermediary goods.
Okay. Professor Mensah, briefly on this one. So those two questions, very quickly, if you can.
Yeah, for IMF program, before the end of the year, we are out. We won't get a program before the end of the year because it's like we are now preparing the grounds to accept the program.
The IMF boss told me they would do everything possible to give us a program by end of year. So you're disputing that?
No, that's not possible. That's not possible because we are now going to read budget, which is somewhere November, and the budget should really position the country for an IMF program in terms of our budget deficit, in terms of the way we want to spend, in terms of the financing of the budget deficit from the central bank government, whether it will be reduced or not. The government should exhibit that readiness, to accept the program. So it's not going to be until maybe the first half of next year. Now, on the inflation, it all depends on the signals that our budget will send. And if the budget gives the signal that government has is going to tone down in borrowing. The government, the budget gives a signal that at the end of the day, we are likely to go into IMF program, and as a result of that, possibly we may have to look at reduction in borrowing on the domestic market. Then possibly that will give that confidence to businesses to say that, okay, fine, we can have access to funding from the domestic market because government is not prepared to, borrow as it used to be. And so we can borrow and then possibly import more. And it also depends on, the exchange rate and how it is behaving. If the exchange rate keeps itself up there, I'm sure, investors, those importers will advise themselves. And we know very well that, if you take our food basket, chunk of them are imported. Then, of course, reorientation, getting into the, festive seasons will also be important because if inflation keeps on, going up and interest rate keeps on going up, exchange rate, keeps on going up, obviously, Ghanaians may have to reorient themselves, getting into the Christmas festivities. Possibly, look at how you can consume, a minimum of imported, product. And that will have a way to control the inflation. So the 40%, it's unlikely we may hit it before the end of the year.
Right. Let's hear you, Mr. Tekpe, on the same questions that Benjamin asked.
Yes, November 15th, a month away, is ambitious. And I wouldn't want to repeat the, debts and other issues that are coming up. What I'd like to say is that the IMF is a bureaucracy. And even when you finalize it, they are now doing the annual meetings, they are preoccupied with it. So, and you cannot, they just came for data gathering and started the first discussions. You cannot complete in a second discussion, which is taking place in Washington, and then come back November 15th. Once an agreement is reached, it will have to go to the Africa Department. If I may talk about process bureaucracy, Africa Department will have to, review the document at the management level, their management level. That document will be circulated to all the departments in the IMF. The departments will come with their comments because remember the fiscal experts, and our problem is fiscal, are not in Africa. They are in the fiscal affairs department. Our monetary issues, central bank and the rest, they are not in Africa. They are in the capital markets division, the IMF. So they will have to comment because they are the ones who have been providing technical assistance. Once these comments are taken on board, assuming there's nothing else the government endorses, it will now go to all the executive directors of the fund for their staff to prepare them for a board meeting. I don't think all of this can be done in a matter of 1 month. In the interest of disclosure, I work at the fund, so I'm talking about, what I know about processes, within, the IMF. So I would say let's look for a good program, not a fast program, because our programs are deep. They need critical solutions. The World Board will have to come in with budget support and other things, and they must also the document will go to their board for a discussion. African Development Bank will also come in. The real sector support are provided by these institutions, not the IMF. The IMF money would be for, ideally, balance of payment support.
Right.
So I think it is highly ambitious. As to inflation, hitting 40%, inflation is about expectations, right? So we know where the sentiments are going now. A lot of sentiments are, and the market is feeding itself, in terms of price increases. So I do not have all the internal, I must be cautious that Professor Gachi from the beginning, I do not have all the internal dynamics and the rest, but I think it is likely, or we could manage not to reach, that point. Whether we reach that point or not, we are already at a 20-year plus high, and that itself is not a good record.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time here this morning. Professor John Gachi, Dean, UCC School of Business, Professor Lord Mensah, a lecturer at the University of Ghana Business School, and Mr. Seth Tekpe, former Finance Minister. We wish you all the best. And they've been discussing this morning the inflation rate, which has hit 37.2, and Ghana going to the IMF, because that's directly linked to inflation. It's one of the ways the government is hoping to deal with our ailing economy. So you've heard what the experts have to say. I don't know how that will inform your decision as a person on how to restructure your life, because it looks like the restructuring has hit
we must all restructure.
individual levels. And so, like the IMF is saying, brace yourself for tougher times. But like Mr. Tekpe said, and I think that that was an interesting quote. Let's look for a deep program, not a fast one. Right. So it's important that we keep that in mind. Benjamin.
Well, we take a breather from here. When we return, NSMQ much later. But Yebe Peja Peja. What is that all about? We're talking that literary festival coming your way from today, Saturday, and through to Sunday. Stay, we'll bring you details of that.